Now, we've been looking at the creation biblical account of the worldwide flood, and it's the most credible scientific evidence, a report that's consistent with what we can observe around the planet, which we've already gone over. Let's take a look at this in K14.htm. We're still there. Now we're going to look up as you know, J. Vernon McGee says, the Earth. Okay. We just asked the question, on the other hand, if evolution is true and humans have lived on the Earth for 3 million years, or many trillions have lived and died, if that's the case, where are the fossils? This is the more vexing question. And Dr. McGee says, as you know, the Earth is not straight on its axis. We are off-center, if you please. The magnetic center is different from the center on which we are revolving. Something happened somewhere along the line, and it is the belief of many that this, the time of the flood, is when it took place. Because the Earth revolves like that, that gives us our seasons and drastic differences in temperature and weather worldwide. So move on to the next page, which is now K15. We had an introduction. The deluge was a global catastrophe and therefore must have had a global cause and produced worldwide geological effects, which we see. It is clearly the greatest physical convulsion that has ever occurred on the Earth since the creation of life itself, and in fact all but obliterated everything living on the face of the Earth. Forget the ages, this one-time event is what's changed the topography of the Earth. There is no escaping the conclusion that if the Bible is true and if the Lord Jesus Christ possessed divine omniscience, which he spoke about, the deluge was the most significant event, geologically speaking, that has ever occurred on the Earth since its creation. We see that. The coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah, for as in the days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So, with the deluge, several factors combined to destroy the antediluvian geophysical equilibrium. Great masses of water and other materials were ejected from below the surface, especially great quantities of molten volcanic rock. On the other hand, equally or more voluminous masses of sediments were formed and deposited in great beds with all that water, possibly often corresponding to what are now called geosynclines, great downward folds of the Earth's crust. Why couldn't the worldwide flood have done that? Of course it could have. A general redisposition of the predeluvian topography took place, placing the crust for a time in a state of isostatic instability. So intensive compressive stresses must have been generated in the crust as previous surface materials began to settle into the voids left by the escaping magmas, the molten volcanic rock, and water. The less competent and less dense newly deposited sediments would have been easily deformed and uplifted under the action of such forces. The heavier cementic materials would tend to sink, forming deep basins, the lighter materials therefore rising and forming the continents. The triggering mechanism that set in motion the forces of isostatic readjustment may well have been the great wind with the gigantic waves and strong currents certainly generated thereby, as the biblical accounts account for. Genesis 8, 1-3, and Psalm 104, 5-9. Here we have it here. Misspelled the word God over here. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were within him in the ark. And God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. And the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and the rain from the sky was restrained, and the water steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days the water decreased. That's a very plausible explanation of what you would observe at that time. 104:5-9 Psalms. He established the earth upon its foundations, so that it will not totter, move out of place, forever and ever. Thou didst cover it with the deep as with the garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the sound of thy thunder they hurried away. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place where thou didst establish for them. Thou didst set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. Interesting. So, finally, in view of the global nature of the catastrophe and the magnitude of the geophysical phenomena accompanying it, it follows that the flood constitutes a profound discontinuity in the normal processes of nature. Any deposit formed before the flood would almost certainly have been profoundly altered by the great complex of hydrodynamic and tectonic forces unleashed during the Deluge period. The fundamental principle in historical geology, that of uniformitarianism, however valid it may be for the study of deposits formed since the Deluge, can therefore not legitimately be applied before that time. This factor is of special importance in the consideration of the so-called absolute geological chronometers that we say today must always have been, which have been interpreted as giving ages for the various strata and for the earth itself. Remember, evolution is based on the fact that they maintain the fossils are as old as the rocks because the rocks are as old as the fossils. That sounds like a stand-up comedian opening up his routine. Cough lozenge. Scripture describes the flood as catastrophic and worldwide, not bound by today's normative processes. So, the fresh olive leaf which the dove retrieved does not indicate a tranquil flood as critics maintain. And look at Genesis 8:11. Scriptures tell us that the dove came into Noah at eventide, and lo, in her mouth an olive leaf plucked off. In other words, a fresh olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off the earth. This olive leaf could not have been an old one floating on the surface of the water, as skeptics would say, for the Hebrew word taraf means plucked off or fresh. And furthermore, it would not have given Noah any indication that the waters were abated from off the earth. The olive tree has green leaves all year through and appears to endure the water, since several accounts give an account of olive trees in the Red Sea. It comes early in Armenia, though not on the heights of Ararat, but lower down, below the walnut, mulberry, and apricot trees in the valleys on the south side. And it is upon the basis of these facts that some argue for a flood so gentle in its movements that not even the trees were disturbed, and the fact that the dove brought back the freshly plucked leaf of an olive tree was supposedly an indication to Noah that the waters had subsided to the level where the olive trees were accustomed to growing. This Charles Lyell, in advocating the tranquil theory, had claimed that the olive branch brought back by the dove seems as clear an indication to us that the vegetation was not destroyed as it was to Noah that the dry land was about to appear. People will twist anything. Lyell says, but the Bible does not say that a dove brought back an olive branch, but merely an olive leaf. The importance of this distinction may be seen from the fact that even if every olive tree in Armenia had been uprooted and covered with the diluvium, it is evident that sufficient time had elapsed to allow for the germination of the seed on the rising grounds, although the plains were still lying under water. Nor is it necessary to suppose that the new olive plant would have to have grown from a seedling. Just as much of modern horticulture is carried on by the use of cuttings from older plants, so also much of the post-diluvian plant life probably began from branches broken, buried near the surface. It is significant that the olive leaf is mentioned. since it is well known that this is a grown tree, this is one of the hardiest of plants, and would be of the first to sprout again in such a cutting after the flood. Even full-grown trees can be subjected to extremely harsh treatment and yet survive. So, the olive tree is virtually indestructible. It can survive in the poor soil through drought, pests, grass fires, years of neglect, revives when fed and irrigated and pruned, and yields prodigious crops. By pruning back the branches to blunt stubs, chopping off the roots and digging out the burl, an olive grower can lift and transplant a full-grown tree anywhere. After a year to recover from the shocking treatment, the burl sends out new roots for moisture, grows new roots, and bears crops anew. F.J. Taylor says in a magazine back in '54, neither does the tree have to grow in the plains. It could have sprouted high in the barren hillsides long before the flood waters retreated to the lowlands. The adaptable nature of the trees permits them to be grown in soils of high lime content, and on rocky hills unsuited for other crops. Arnold Crokermel states, it must be kept in mind that even mountain peaks would have been only a few hundred feet above sea level during the weeks immediately following the grounding of the ark. Consequently, climatic conditions could have been most favorable at that time for the rapid sprouting of leaves from an olive tree cutting even on the highest mountains. That only a few months would be needed for the time of implantation of cutting until the sprouting of leaves is indicated by the fact that even today cuttings are therefore almost universally used for the olive tree propagation. Thus, the record of the dove and the olive leaf harmonizes perfectly with what is known of the nature of the olive tree and with the biblical account of the great world-destroying flood. But there are always skeptics. Don't do the homework. Furthermore, the fact that 135 days elapsed after the waters began to assuage before the dove could find a living leaf is eloquent testimony in itself to the vast destructiveness of the flood. It was worldwide, and it was cataclysmic. However, marine life did survive the universal catastrophic flood. How could fish survive the Genesis flood? That's the question. Well, water life has specific physiological and ecological requirements just like terrestrial life. A catastrophe, the size of the flood, will certainly bring with its gigantic problems affecting the very survival of many species. Indeed, the fossil record indicates that many taxonomic groups become extinct during the deposition of the geologic sedimentary layers. Some organisms would have simply succumbed to the trauma of the turbulence. Others would have found suitable living space destroyed and hence died for lack of appropriate habitat. For example, too much fresh water for obligate bound to marine species or vice versa would have led to the death of those unable to adapt. Not only are there salt concentration problems, but also temperature, light, oxygen, contaminants, and nutritional considerations. These must all be evaluated in discussing survival of water-dwelling creatures. Sorry for this cold. You get old, you get colds. You get young, you get colds. Now the subject of salinity. How do fish survive? Fish have a problem in balancing their fluids outside of their bodies with those inside. In general, freshwater fishes are constantly getting too much fresh water in their bodies from food, drinking water, and tissue transfer. On the opposite side, marine fishes get too little fresh water to maintain fluid balance due to the large input of salt in the drinking water and constant osmotic pressure to draw fresh water out of their tissues into the surrounding sea.